Marcus Thompson's day had started just like any other Tuesday. At 32 years old, he had already established himself as one of the most reliable software engineers at TechCore Solutions, where he worked for the past 5 years. The autumn evening was settling in, and the clock on his computer showed 7:45 p.m., another late night at the office. His coworkers had all left hours ago, but Marcus wanted to finish debugging a crucial piece of code for tomorrow's client presentation. The office was quiet except for the soft tapping of his keyboard and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. The city lights were starting to twinkle outside his 20th floor office window, creating a peaceful backdrop to his work. Finally satisfied with his progress, Marcus gathered his things. He carefully placed his laptop in his leather messenger bag, a recent birthday gift from his mother, and straightened his desk. Even after a long day, he still wore his navy blue suit perfectly pressed, a habit his father had instilled in him since childhood. "Presentation matters, son," his father would always say. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was quick and silent. As he walked toward his parking spot, his footsteps echoed against the concrete walls. There, in Space B-47, sat his pride and joy, a 1967 Chevrolet Impala, painted in classic black with chrome trim that gleamed even in the dim garage lighting. The car wasn't just a vehicle, it was 3 years of memories, countless weekends spent with his father in their home garage, rebuilding it piece by piece. Marcus remembered how they found the car in a junkyard outside the city. It had been nothing but a rusted shell then, but his father, William Thompson, had seen its potential. "That's the same model I drove when I first met your mother," he'd said with a sparkle in his eyes. Together, they had brought the classic car back to life, spending every available weekend working on it, sharing stories, and strengthening their bond. As he slid into the driver's seat, Marcus ran his hands over the restored leather steering wheel. The interior smelled of leather conditioner and the subtle scent of the pine air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. The engine started with a rich, deep rumble that always brought a smile to his face. This wasn't just transportation, this was his heritage on wheels. Pulling out of the parking garage, Marcus decided to stop at Jerry's convenience store on 5th Street. He needed some coffee for tomorrow morning, and his mother had asked him to pick up her favorite magazine if he got the chance. The store was just a few blocks away from his route home to the suburbs. The streets were relatively quiet for a Tuesday evening. A few people were walking their dogs, and the occasional car passed by. The Impala's headlights cut through the growing darkness, and the engine's purr turned heads as he drove past the downtown shops. Marcus had gotten used to the attention the car attracted. Classic car enthusiasts often approached him at gas stations to ask about the restoration. As he pulled into Jerry's parking lot, the overhead lights reflected off the Impala's perfectly waxed surface. Marcus had spent the entire previous Sunday detailing the car, making sure every inch of chrome sparkled. He parked carefully, making sure to leave enough space on either side to prevent door dings. Old habits die hard, and this one had been drilled into him by his father's careful instruction. Before getting out, Marcus checked his phone. There was a text from his mother reminding him about Sunday dinner, and another from his sister sharing pictures of his nephew's first soccer game. He smiled, typing quick replies to both. The dashboard clock showed 8:15 p.m., plenty of time to get home and prepare for tomorrow's presentation. Marcus adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, another habit he'd picked up from his father. Everything about him spoke of professionalism and care, from his well-maintained car to his polished appearance. He reached into the glove compartment to grab his wallet, brushing against the photo album he always kept there, a documentation of every step of the car's restoration process. As he stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hit his face. The convenience store's fluorescent lights buzzed quietly, and through the windows, you could see Jerry himself behind the counter, reading a newspaper. It seemed like a perfectly normal evening, just another stop on his way home from work. Marcus had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes, his ordinary evening would take an extraordinary turn. Marcus spent less than 5 minutes inside Jerry's convenience store. He picked up his coffee, his mother's favorite gardening magazine, and even grabbed a chocolate bar, a small reward for his long workday. Jerry, who had known him as a regular customer for the past 3 years, waved goodbye as he pushed open the glass door, plastic bag swinging lightly in his hand. The peaceful evening shattered the moment Marcus stepped into the parking lot. 2 police cruisers, their red and blue lights painting the night in alternating colors, screeched into the lot from opposite directions. Their sirens were silent, but their presence was overwhelming. Marcus froze mid-step, his shopping bag suddenly feeling heavy in his hand. "Stop right there, hands where we can see them." The command cut through the night air like a knife. Officer Sarah Chen emerged from the first cruiser, her hand resting firmly on her holster. Her partner, Officer Rodriguez, flanked from the other side, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness and focusing directly on Marcus's face. Marcus's heart began to race, but his father's words echoed in his mind. "Always stay calm, son. Panic never helped anyone." With deliberate slowness, he placed his shopping bag on the ground and raised his hands, palms facing forward. The chocolate bar he bought slipped out and rolled across the pavement. "Step away from the vehicle," Officer Chen commanded, her voice steady but intense. Marcus noticed she was younger than him, probably in her late 20s, but her authority was unmistakable. He took 3 careful steps forward, his expensive dress shoes clicking against the asphalt. "We received a report of a suspected car theft in progress," Officer Rodriguez announced, moving closer. A black male attempting to steal a classic Chevrolet Impala. His flashlight beam swept from Marcus to the car and back again. "Officers, there must be some mistake," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This is my car. I can show you the registration and insurance. They're in the glove compartment." 2 more police cruisers pulled into the lot, their arrival adding to the chaos of flashing lights. Jerry had come out of his store and stood watching from the doorway, concern evident on his face. A small crowd of onlookers began to gather at the edges of the parking lot, some holding up their phones, recording the scene. "Don't move," Officer Chen said as Marcus instinctively shifted toward the car. "How do you explain having access to this vehicle?" Her question carried a weight of suspicion that made Marcus's stomach tighten. "I own it," Marcus replied, fighting to keep his voice level. "I restored it with my father. We spent 3 years working on it together. Every weekend, piece by piece. I have photos of the entire restoration process in the glove compartment, along with all the legal documentation." Officer Rodriguez circled the Impala, his flashlight beam dancing across its polished surface. "This is a valuable classic car," he noted, his tone skeptical. "What did you say you do for a living?" "I'm a software engineer at TechCore Solutions," Marcus answered, acutely aware of how the growing crowd was watching the scene unfold. "I just left the office. You can call them to verify. My employee ID is in my wallet." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. More officers had positioned themselves around the perimeter, their hands hovering near their weapons. Marcus could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air, but he remained still, hands raised, breathing measured. Jerry finally spoke up from his doorway. "Officers, I can vouch for him. He's a regular customer. That's his car. I see him with it all the time." Officer Chen's eyes flickered between Marcus and Jerry, then back to the gleaming Impala. Something in her expression shifted slightly, a subtle change that suggested she was beginning to question the situation. But protocol kept her hand near her weapon, her stance ready for any sudden movements. Marcus stood there, his arms beginning to ache from being held up, his mind racing through all the documentation he could provide to prove his ownership. The chocolate bar he dropped earlier had rolled to a stop against his shoe, a small reminder of how quickly an ordinary evening had transformed into something far more serious. The red and blue lights continued their rhythmic dance across the parking lot, illuminating faces in the growing crowd, as the situation teetered on the edge of either resolution or escalation. The tension in Jerry's parking lot had reached its peak. Officer Sarah Chen stood still for a moment, her trained eyes studying Marcus's calm demeanor. In her 3 years on the force, she had handled numerous car theft cases, but something about this one felt different. The suspect, if he was indeed a suspect, wasn't showing the typical signs of guilt or aggression she had come to expect. Marcus's arms were still raised, his expensive suit jacket pulling slightly at the shoulders. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple, but his eyes remained steady, meeting Officer Chen's gaze with a mixture of patience and controlled frustration. The crowd around them had grown larger, their phone cameras recording every moment, creating a soft glow of screens in the darkening evening. Officer Chen made a decision that would later be described as a turning point. "Lower your arms slowly," she instructed, her voice taking on a slightly softer tone. but please stay where you are." As Marcus complied, she noticed how he moved with deliberate care, making sure his movements couldn't be misinterpreted. "You mentioned photos of the restoration," Officer Chen said, taking a small step forward. "Tell me about them." This wasn't standard procedure, and she could feel her partner, Officer Rodriguez, shifting uncomfortably behind her. Marcus's face lit up slightly at the mention of the restoration, despite the tense situation. "Every single step is documented," he explained, his voice becoming more animated but still maintaining its professional tone. "The first photo shows the car when we found it in Wilson's junkyard. It was just a rusted shell then. My father and I." Officer Chen noticed something crucial as Marcus spoke. The intimate details he shared about the car's restoration weren't the kind of information a car thief would know. He described specific challenges they'd faced with the transmission, the weeks spent hunting down original parts, and the debate he'd had with his father about whether to modernize the radio system. "The hardest part was finding the original chrome trim pieces," Marcus continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "We finally located them at a specialty shop in Milwaukee. My father and I drove there on a Saturday, 14 hours round trip. He told me stories about his own father the whole way there." Jerry, still watching from his store's entrance, took a cautious step forward. "Officers, I've known Marcus for years. He comes in almost every weeknight after work. That car is his baby. He even parks it in the same spot every time, away from other vehicles." Officer Chen made another unconventional decision. "Mr. Thompson," she said, using his name for the first time, "I'm going to approach the vehicle with you. We'll check the documentation together." She turned to her fellow officers. "Stand down, but stay alert." As they walked toward the Impala, Marcus described how he and his father had worked every weekend for 3 years to restore the car. Officer Chen noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the glove compartment, not from guilt, but from the lingering stress of the situation. The photo album inside was worn at the edges, clearly handled often. As Marcus opened it, Officer Chen saw the first photo, a much younger Marcus standing next to a rusted car shell, his father's arm around his shoulders, both of them grinning with anticipation of the project ahead. Page after page showed the car's transformation. There were detailed photos of engine work, interior restoration, and paint processes. Marcus's father appeared in many of the pictures, teaching his son the intricacies of classic car restoration. The timestamps on the photos created a clear timeline of the 3-year project. "This was the day we finally got her running," Marcus said, pointing to a photo where he and his father sat in the front seat, their faces showing pure joy. Officer Chen noticed the date stamp matched the registration papers perfectly. The growing crowd watched as Officer Chen's posture gradually relaxed. She turned to her fellow officers and nodded, signaling that the situation was under control. The red and blue lights that had been painting the scene in urgent colors began to switch off one by one. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, Mr. Thompson," Officer Chen said, her voice carrying across the now quiet parking lot. "Someone reported a car theft, but they clearly made some incorrect assumptions." She emphasized the word assumptions, loud enough for the crowd to hear. The tension in the air began to dissolve, replaced by a different kind of energy. The bystanders who had been recording everything started lowering their phones, realizing they were witnessing something unexpected. A moment where understanding triumphed over prejudice, where taking time to listen changed everything. Officer Rodriguez approached, looking at the photo album with genuine interest. "This is impressive restoration work," he admitted, his earlier suspicion replaced by professional respect. The night was taking a turn that none of them had expected, all because one officer had chosen to look beyond initial appearances and listen to the story behind them. The atmosphere in the parking lot had shifted dramatically. Officer Chen's decision to listen had opened a door to understanding, but now came the crucial part: documenting the evidence that would officially clear Marcus's name. The remaining police cruiser's lights cast a soft glow over the scene as Officer Chen and Marcus stood by the Impala's open passenger door. Marcus carefully lifted out the thick leather folder from the glove compartment, his hands now steady with renewed confidence. "Everything's here," he said, placing the folder on the car's hood. Under the parking lot lights, he began laying out document after document with the precision of someone who understood the importance of being thorough. First came the car's original title, slightly yellowed but perfectly preserved in a plastic sleeve. The document clearly showed the transfer of ownership from Wilson's junkyard to Marcus Thompson, dated exactly 3 years and 4 months ago. Officer Chen picked it up, studying the official stamps and signatures while Officer Rodriguez shone his flashlight for better visibility. "Here's every receipt from the restoration," Marcus explained, pulling out a meticulously organized stack of papers. Each receipt was dated, categorized, and attached to photographs showing the parts being installed, from spark plugs to leather seats, every piece that had gone into transforming the jumped car into the gleaming Impala before them was accounted for. Jerry, who had been watching from a respectful distance, approached with his own evidence. "I've got security footage of Marcus with this car going back 3 years, he offered, holding up his phone. "He stops here almost every weeknight after work. Same spot, same time, same car." Officer Chen nodded, then turned her attention to a particularly thick envelope Marcus was now opening. Inside was something that made even the most skeptical officers gather around: a complete photographic journey of the car's restoration. But these weren't just the before and after shots typical of car restorations. These photos told a deeper story. The first series showed Marcus and his father, William, at Wilson's junkyard. They were standing next to the rusted shell of the Impala, pointing at various parts, planning their project. The date stamp matched perfectly with the title transfer. Marcus's father, a tall man with kind eyes and graying temples, had his arm around his son's shoulders in every shot. "My dad took photos of every major step," Marcus explained, his voice softening with pride. "He said we needed to document the journey, not just the destination." He spread out more photos across the hood, creating a timeline of transformation. There were pictures of Marcus learning to rebuild the engine, his father guiding his hands on the tools. Photos of them working late into the night, the garage light casting long shadows as they fitted new panels. Images of Marcus's mother bringing them lemonade during hot summer work sessions. Each photo was dated, each showing the gradual progress from rust bucket to classic beauty. Officer Rodriguez, who had mentioned earlier that his own father had been a mechanic, picked up a photo showing the engine rebuild. "This is professional-grade work," he said, his expert eye noting the attention to detail. "You can't fake this kind of restoration knowledge." Marcus then pulled out what Officer Chen would later describe in her report as the most compelling piece of evidence: a small, worn notebook. "My father's project diary," he explained, handling it with obvious care. Inside, William Thompson had documented every step of the restoration in his neat handwriting. There were technical notes, supply lists, and personal observations about working with his son. "Look at this entry," Marcus said, turning to a page dated 2 years ago. "Dad wrote about teaching me how to color match the paint. We spent 3 weekends getting it exactly right." The entry included paint codes, mixing ratios, and a small swatch of the final color. As Officer Chen reviewed the evidence, more patrol cars began to leave the scene. The crowd of onlookers had thinned, though some stayed to watch the unusual turn of events. Instead of a confrontation, they were witnessing something rarely seen: a thorough and respectful verification of a black man's legitimate ownership of a valuable vehicle. Jerry returned from his store with copies of his security footage, showing months of Marcus's routine visits. The final piece of evidence was Marcus's employee ID from TechCore Solutions, complete with a photo showing him in the same professional attire he wore now. "Mr. Thompson," Officer Chen said, carefully returning the documents to their folder, "your documentation is impeccable. It's clear that this car represents much more than just transportation to you." She paused, looking at a photo of Marcus and his father standing proudly beside the newly completed Impala. "It's a legacy." The evidence wasn't just proving ownership. It was telling the story of a father and son, of craftsmanship passed down, of memories carefully preserved. In the face of such thorough documentation, initial suspicions had given way to understanding and even admiration. Officer Sarah Chen stood in Jerry's parking lot, the weight of her next decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. The evidence was clear. Marcus Thompson was the rightful owner of the 1967 Chevrolet Impala. But for Officer Chen, this situation had evolved beyond the simple case of mistaken identity. In her 3 years on the force, no incident had made her question standard procedures quite like this one. She watched as Marcus carefully returned the photo album and documents to his glove compartment. His movements were precise, respectful, the same care he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. The remaining officers stood by their vehicles, awaiting her next move. The usual protocol would be to simply apologize and leave, file a report, and let the incident fade into the statistics of unfounded complaints. But something deeper stirred in Officer Chen's conscience. She thought about her own father, a Chinese immigrant who had faced similar prejudices when he first opened his restaurant in the city. How many times had people questioned his ownership of the business? How many times had he had to prove himself beyond what should have been necessary? "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice carrying across the now quiet parking lot. "Could you spare a few more minutes?" Marcus turned, his expression curious but still guarded. Officer Chen motioned for her fellow officers to gather around. "I want to apologize," she began, making sure her voice was loud enough for the remaining bystanders to hear. "But more than that, I want to acknowledge something important." She removed her cap, a gesture that made her appear more approachable, more human. "We responded to a call tonight based on assumptions and bias. Someone saw a black man with an expensive classic car and jumped to conclusions." Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably beside her, but Officer Chen continued. "What we found instead was a story of family, dedication, and craftsmanship. Mr. Thompson didn't just prove he owns this car. He showed us what it means to build something meaningful with your family." She turned to address her fellow officers directly. "This is why we need to question our initial assumptions. This is why we need to listen first." Several officers nodded, their expressions thoughtful. One of them, Officer Martinez, stepped forward. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "my father restored cars too. The work you've done here, it's exceptional." The genuine admiration in his voice helped ease more of the lingering tension. Officer Chen made a decision that would later be marked as a turning point in her career. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to formally document this incident, not just as a mistaken call, but as a teaching opportunity for our department." She pulled out her notebook. "Would you be willing to speak at our next training session? Share your experience. Help us do better?" Marcus looked surprised. This wasn't the usual ending to such encounters. "You want me to speak to other officers?" he asked, seeking clarification. "Yes," Officer Chen replied firmly. "Your story, how you remained calm, how you documented everything so carefully, how you and your father built this car together, it's powerful. It could help change perspectives." Jerry, who had been watching from nearby, spoke up. "I got all the security camera footage from tonight. Shows everything from when the first patrol car arrived. Could be useful for training too." Officer Chen nodded appreciatively. "Perfect. Mr. Thompson, this is completely voluntary, but I believe your voice could make a real difference." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her business card, then wrote her personal cell number on the back. "Think about it. Either way, I want you to have a direct line to me if you ever need it." The remaining crowd watched as Officer Chen extended her hand to Marcus. It was more than a handshake. It was an acknowledgement of dignity, an offer of alliance rather than opposition. Marcus accepted both the handshake and the card, his expression showing cautious optimism. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of consideration. "Maybe sharing this experience could prevent someone else from going through the same thing." Officer Chen turned to her team. "I want detailed reports from everyone, focusing on how this encounter evolved and what we learned. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about growing as officers and as people." The night air had cooled, but the atmosphere had warmed with understanding. As the last patrol cars prepared to leave, Officer Chen watched Marcus finally return to his car. The Impala's engine came to life with a rich rumble that spoke of the care and craftsmanship invested in it. She made a final notation in her notebook, not about a suspected car theft, but about a lesson in judgment, listening, and the courage to change course when faced with truth. 2 weeks after the incident at Jerry's parking lot, Marcus Thompson stood in front of a mirror in his home, adjusting his tie. The invitation to speak at the police department's training session had turned from a possibility into reality. His father, William, sat on the couch nearby, pride evident in his eyes as he watched his son prepare for what could be a pivotal moment. "Remember, son," William said, his voice carrying the wisdom of years, "this isn't about anger or blame. It's about creating understanding." Marcus nodded, thinking about how his father's calm guidance had helped him maintain his composure that night at the convenience store. The police department's training room was packed when Marcus arrived. Officer Chen met him at the entrance, her welcoming smile helping to ease his nervousness. The room was filled with about 50 officers, some veterans, others fresh from the academy. All eyes turned to Marcus as he walked to the front of the room. "This is Mr. Marcus Thompson," Officer Chen began the introduction. "2 weeks ago, we responded to a call about a suspected car theft. What happened next changed how many of us think about our approach to situations." She gestured to a large screen where Jerry's security camera footage began playing. Marcus watched along with the officers as the scene unfolded on screen. The arrival of the patrol cars, his raised hands, the tense moments. It all looked different from this perspective. When the footage reached the point where Officer Chen decided to listen rather than escalate, she paused the video. Before Mr. Thompson shares his experience, Officer Chen addressed her colleagues. "I want you to notice something. Look at his composure, his responses, the way he handled himself. But also look at what we, as officers, did right and wrong in those first crucial moments." Marcus stepped forward, his hand steady as he opened the same photo album that had helped clear his name that night. "I want to start by showing you something," he said, connecting his laptop to the projector. The first image that appeared was of him and his father standing next to the rusted shell of the Impala. "This is where it began," Marcus explained, his voice growing stronger. Not with a traffic stop or a suspicious call, but with a father and son's dream to rebuild something beautiful together. He clicked through more photos, showing the restoration process, explaining how each step had been documented not just for posterity, but because his father had taught him the importance of being able to prove his work. The officers leaned forward in their seats as Marcus described the night of the incident. He didn't speak with anger, but with honesty about how it felt to be assumed guilty because of his skin color. He shared how his father's lessons about staying calm and his own habit of keeping meticulous records had possibly prevented the situation from becoming tragic. "But I'm not here just to tell you about what went wrong," Marcus continued. "I'm here because Officer Chen did something right." She stopped, she listened, and she looked at the evidence. That decision changed everything. During the question and answer session that followed, officers asked thoughtful questions about how they could better handle similar situations. One veteran officer raised his hand. "Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to help us develop a training program? Your experience could help shape how we approach these encounters." Officer Chen stepped forward with a proposal she had been developing. "We're thinking about creating a community engagement initiative," she explained. "Regular meetings between officers and community members, sharing stories, understanding each other's perspectives. Mr. Thompson's story could be the foundation." The energy in the room was transforming from professional attention to genuine engagement. Officers were taking notes, asking questions about implementing changes in their daily procedures. Marcus found himself drawing on his software engineering background, suggesting ways to better document and share positive community interactions. As the session wound down, the police chief approached Marcus. "We'd like to make this a regular thing," he said. "Not just your story, but creating space for other community members to share their experiences. Would you help us build this bridge?" Marcus looked at Officer Chen, who nodded encouragingly. He thought about his father's words about creating understanding, about how one incident had the potential to spark real change. "Yes," he replied, "I'd be honored to help." The training session had run over its scheduled time, but no one seemed to mind. Officers lingered, examining the photo album, asking questions about the car restoration, sharing their own stories. What had started as a response to a tense encounter was evolving into something more meaningful, a genuine dialogue between law enforcement and the community they served. As Marcus packed up his materials, Officer Chen approached with a stack of business cards. "These are from officers who want to learn more about your story and the program we're developing," she said. "I think we've started something important here." Marcus took the cards, thinking about how his father's lessons in patience, documentation, and dignity had helped transform a potentially dangerous situation into an opportunity for positive change. The bridges being built in that training room would extend far beyond one man and his classic car. 3 months after Marcus's presentation at the police training session, the impact of that night at Jerry's convenience store had spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The local news station's initial coverage of the incident, including the security footage and the positive resolution, had gone viral on social media, catching the attention of national news outlets. One sunny Saturday morning, Marcus pulled his Impala into the police department's parking lot for what had become a regular community meeting. The car, which had once been the source of suspicion, was now a symbol of positive change. As he walked into the community room, he was greeted by familiar faces: Officer Chen, other police officers, and various community members who had become regular participants in their dialogue sessions. "Marcus, have you seen this?" Officer Chen approached him with a tablet, showing an email from a police department in Atlanta. They wanted to implement a similar program after hearing about the success in their city. It was the fifth such request this month. The room was buzzing with activity. On one wall hung a large board covered with photographs and news clippings documenting their progress. The centerpiece was a picture from that first training session, showing Marcus sharing his story with the officers. Around it were snapshots of subsequent community meetings, workshops, and the positive changes that had resulted. Jerry, who had become an active participant in these meetings, arrived with a box of donuts from his store. "You won't believe what happened yesterday," he said, setting down the box. "A young black man came into my store, driving a restored classic Mustang. Instead of calling the police, Mrs. Johnson from across the street came in to compliment him on the car. She said our meetings had changed how she thinks about things." The ripple effect wasn't just changing attitudes, it was changing statistics. Officer Rodriguez presented the latest data during the meeting. Traffic stops based on suspicious vehicle ownership had decreased by 40% in their precinct. More importantly, community complaints about police profiling had dropped significantly, while positive interactions had increased. Local auto clubs had gotten involved too. The Classic Car Association, which had been predominantly white, reached out to Marcus to help organize joint community events. These gatherings brought together car enthusiasts from all backgrounds, with police officers often participating as both car fans and community members. Marcus's father, William, had become a regular speaker at these events, sharing not just his knowledge of car restoration, but also his wisdom about building trust and understanding across generations and racial divides. His gentle manner and technical expertise helped bridge gaps between different groups in ways that formal programs couldn't achieve. The media continued to follow the story. A local filmmaker had begun documenting the transformation, interviewing community members, officers, and participants in the program. The working title was More Than a Car: How One Incident Changed a City. One of the most significant developments came from the business community. TechCore Solutions, where Marcus worked, had pledged support for a new initiative. They were developing a free app that would help car owners digitally store and easily access their vehicle documentation, inspired by Marcus's meticulous record-keeping that had proved so crucial that night. Officer Chen had been promoted to lead a new community relations division, created specifically to expand and manage these programs. She often consulted with Marcus on new initiatives, valuing his perspective as both a program founder and community member. "We've had requests from 20 different police departments across the country," she told the group during their meeting. "They want to know how we turned a potential crisis into an opportunity for change." The impact reached into unexpected areas. Local schools had begun inviting Marcus and Officer Chen to speak to students about civic engagement and community relations. Young people were especially drawn to the car restoration aspect of the story, leading to the creation of a mentorship program pairing experienced mechanics with interested youth. Even Jerry's convenience store had transformed. What had been just another stop and shop became a symbolic meeting point for community dialogue. He had cleared a wall for photos of classic cars owned by local residents, each with its own story, creating an informal museum of community pride. As the meeting wound down, Marcus received a text from a national news program requesting an interview. They wanted to feature the program as part of a series on innovative community policing initiatives. But what made Marcus most proud wasn't the national attention. It was the small changes he observed daily, the friendly waves between officers and residents, the decreased tension during traffic stops, the growing understanding between different parts of the community. The ripple effect had transformed one potentially tragic incident into a wave of positive change, proving that sometimes the most powerful movements start with a simple decision to listen and understand. 1 year after the incident at Jerry's convenience store, Marcus Thompson stood in front of a converted warehouse that had become the home of Bridges Auto Workshop. a community program that no one could have imagined 12 months ago. The massive space housed 5 classic cars in various stages of restoration, each one representing a story of connection and change. The workshop had started as a simple idea, using classic car restoration to build relationships between police officers and local youth. Now, on its first anniversary, the program had transformed lives in ways that went far beyond automotive skills. Inside the workshop, Officer Chen, now Commander Chen, worked alongside 16-year-old Jamal Carter, teaching him how to sand down a 1965 Mustang's hood. Nearby, Marcus's father William supervised a group that included 2 rookie police officers and 3 teenagers as they rebuilt an engine. The sound of tools, laughter, and friendly conversation filled the air. "Remember what I taught you about patience," William said to the group, his voice carrying the same wisdom that had guided Marcus through their own restoration project. "You can't rush perfection, whether you're building a car or building trust." The walls of the workshop told their own story. Photos of completed projects hung beside newspaper clippings about the program's success. A particularly prominent display showed the progression from that tense night at Jerry's to the present day. The 1967 Impala that had started it all occupied a special place of honor near the entrance, serving as inspiration for new projects. Marcus walked through the workshop, stopping to check on each group's progress. The program had grown to include 4 sessions per week, with a waiting list of both youth and officers wanting to participate. What made it unique was its requirement that each restoration project team include at least 1 police officer, 1 community mentor, and 2 young people. Today was special. They were celebrating not just the program's anniversary, but also the completion of their 5th restoration project. A 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle, restored by Officer Rodriguez and 2 local teenagers, was ready for its reveal. The car's owner, an elderly community member who couldn't afford the restoration, would be seeing it for the first time. Local news cameras captured the moment as Mrs. Johnson, a 72-year-old retired teacher, walked into the workshop. Her husband had left her the Chevelle when he passed away 15 years ago, but it had sat untouched in her garage, deteriorating. When the program heard her story, they chose her car as their next project. Tears filled Mrs. Johnson's eyes as Officer Rodriguez and his young team pulled the cover off the perfectly restored Chevelle. The car gleamed under the workshop lights, its deep blue paint reflecting months of careful work and dedication. But more valuable than the restoration itself were the bonds formed between the team members during the process. "This program," Mrs. Johnson addressed the gathered crowd, her voice thick with emotion, "hasn't just restored my Henry's car. It's restored my faith in what we can accomplish when we work together." The success of Bridges Auto Workshop had inspired similar programs in other cities. Marcus and Commander Chen had been invited to speak at police departments across the country, sharing their model of community engagement. The program had even caught the attention of federal law enforcement agencies interested in implementing similar initiatives nationally. What made Marcus most proud, however, were the small victories, like watching former program participants mentor new ones, or seeing officers and youth working together so naturally that it was hard to remember there had ever been barriers between them. As the celebration continued, Jerry arrived with refreshments from his store. His shop had become an unofficial extension of the program, with his wall of classic car photos now needing expansion to accommodate all the success stories. William pulled Marcus aside during the festivities. "You know, son," he said, looking around the bustling workshop, "when we were restoring that Impala, I thought I was just teaching you about cars. But look what you built here. It's so much more than that." Marcus nodded, watching as a young girl learned how to check engine timing from a veteran officer. The lesson wasn't just about mechanics. It was about trust, respect, and understanding. The legacy of that night at Jerry's had evolved into something permanent and meaningful. As the sun set through the workshop's windows, casting long shadows across the tools and cars, Marcus realized that they had built more than just a program. They had created a blueprint for change. The workshop had become a place where stereotypes disappeared under the hood of a car. 1 year after the incident at Jerry's convenience store, Marcus Thompson stood in front of a converted warehouse that had become the home of Bridges Auto Workshop, a community program that no one could have imagined 12 months ago. The massive space housed 5 classic cars in various stages of restoration, each one representing a story of connection and change. The workshop had started as a simple idea, using classic car restoration to build relationships between police officers and local youth. Now, on its first anniversary, the program had transformed lives in ways that went far beyond automotive skills. Inside the workshop, Officer Chen, now Commander Chen, worked alongside 16-year-old Jummel Carter, teaching him how to sand down a 1965 Mustang's hood. Nearby, Marcus's father William supervised a group that included 2 rookie police officers and 3 teenagers as they rebuilt an engine. The sound of tools, laughter, and friendly conversation filled the air. "Remember what I taught you about patience," William said to the group, his voice carrying the same wisdom that had guided Marcus through their own restoration project. "You can't rush perfection, whether you're building a car or building trust." The walls of the workshop told their own story. Photos of completed projects hung beside newspaper clippings about the program's success. A particularly prominent display showed the progression from that tense night at Jerry's to the present day. The 1967 Impala that had started it all occupied a special place of honor near the entrance, serving as inspiration for new projects. Marcus walked through the workshop, stopping to check on each group's progress. The program had grown to include 4 sessions per week, with a waiting list of both youth and officers wanting to participate. What made it unique was its requirement that each restoration project team include at least 1 police officer, 1 community mentor, and 2 young people. Today was special. They were celebrating not just the program's anniversary, but also the completion of their 5th restoration project. A 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle, restored by Officer Rodriguez and 2 local teenagers, was ready for its reveal. The car's owner, an elderly community member who couldn't afford the restoration, would be seeing it for the first time. Local news cameras captured the moment as Mrs. Johnson, a 72-year-old retired teacher, walked into the workshop. Her husband had left her the Chevelle when he passed away 15 years ago, but it had sat untouched in her garage, deteriorating. When the program heard her story, they chose her car as their next project. Tears filled Mrs. Johnson's eyes as Officer Rodriguez and his young team pulled the cover off the perfectly restored Chevelle. The car gleamed under the workshop lights, its deep blue paint reflecting months of careful work and dedication. But more valuable than the restoration itself were the bonds formed between the team members during the process. "This program," Mrs. Johnson addressed the gathered crowd, her voice thick with emotion, "hasn't just restored my Henry's car. It's restored my faith in what we can accomplish when we work together." The success of Bridges Auto Workshop had inspired similar programs in other cities. Marcus and Commander Chen had been invited to speak at police departments across the country, sharing their model of community engagement. The program had even caught the attention of federal law enforcement agencies interested in implementing similar initiatives nationally. What made Marcus most proud, however, were the small victories. Like watching former program participants mentor new ones, or seeing officers and youth working together so naturally that it was hard to remember there had ever been barriers between them. As the celebration continued, Jerry arrived with refreshments from his store. His shop had become an unofficial extension of the program, with his wall of classic car photos now needing expansion to accommodate all the success stories. William pulled Marcus aside during the festivities. "You know, son," he said, looking around the bustling workshop, "when we were restoring that Impala, I thought I was just teaching you about cars. But look what you built here. It's so much more than that." Marcus nodded, watching as a young girl learned how to check engine timing from a veteran officer. The lesson wasn't just about mechanics. It was about trust, respect, and understanding. The legacy of that night at Jerry's had evolved into something permanent and meaningful. The legacy would continue, car by car, story by story, connection by connection, proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations start with a simple willingness to look beyond appearances and listen to each other's stories.